I never thought a light dusting of freezing rain would turn my life into a legal battlefield. But that's exactly what happened when Patricia Henderson decided my front steps weren't up to her standards. It started on a Tuesday morning in February when I was rushing to get to work at the engineering firm downtown in Columbus, Ohio. I'd barely had time to grab my coffee when I saw the certified letter taped to my front door. The envelope bore the official seal of the Riverside Meadows Homeowners Association, and my stomach dropped before I even opened it. Nothing good ever came in those envelopes. Inside was a violation notice with a photograph of my front steps taken at what looked like 6 in the morning. There was a thin layer of ice visible on the concrete, maybe a quarter-inch at most from the freezing rain that had fallen overnight. The fine was $250, with an additional $50 per day if the violation wasn't corrected immediately. The letter was signed by Patricia Henderson, HOA board president, in her characteristic aggressive scrawl. I stood there in my driveway, my breath forming clouds in the cold air, reading the notice 3 times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. The ice had formed sometime after midnight. It was now 7 in the morning. They expected me to have somehow cleared ice that had formed while I was sleeping, before dawn even broke. My name is Xavier Morrison, and I'd lived in this subdivision for 3 years. In that time, I'd received exactly 14 violation notices from the HOA for things ranging from my mailbox being the wrong shade of black to leaving my trash cans visible from the street for 20 minutes longer than allowed. But this was different. This was insane. I pulled out my phone and took several pictures of my steps. The morning sun was already starting to melt the ice. I scattered some salt I kept in my garage, watching it begin its work immediately, then headed to my car. I was going to be late for work, but I needed to document everything. As I drove through the neighborhood, I made a point to look at every single house I passed. At least a dozen properties had ice on their walkways and driveways, some hadicicles hanging from their gutters that looked downright dangerous. But somehow, I was the only one who'd received a violation notice. I pulled over and photographed several of the worst offenders, making sure to get the house numbers clearly visible. The workday dragged. I tried to focus on the bridge design specifications I was reviewing, but my mind kept wandering back to that ridiculous fine. $250 for ice that had formed overnight. During my lunch break, I called the HOA management office. Riverside Meadows HOA, this is Jennifer speaking. Hi, Jennifer. This is Xavier Morrison from 482 Maple Grove Drive. I received a violation notice this morning that I need to discuss with someone. There was a pause, then the sound of typing. Oh, yes, the ice violation. What questions do you have, Mr. Morrison? Well, for starters, how am I supposed to prevent ice from forming on my steps overnight? I'm not aware of any weather control technology available to homeowners. Jennifer's voice took on a rehearsed quality. The HOA bylaws clearly state that all walkways must be maintained in a safe condition at all times. Ice presents a safety hazard. The ice formed after midnight. Your inspector photographed my house before dawn. I was asleep. The bylaws don't make exceptions for the time of day, Mr. Morrison. Mrs. Henderson takes safety very seriously. Then, why are there a dozen other houses in this neighborhood with ice on their walkways that didn't get violation notices? Another pause. I can only speak to your specific property, sir. If you'd like to appeal the fine, you can submit a written request to appear before the board at next month's meeting. Next month. The fine increases by $50 every day I don't pay it. The daily fine is for continued violations, Mr. Morrison. Once you've cleared the ice and submitted photographic proof, the daily charges will stop, but the initial fine stands unless the board overturns it. I hung up after getting the details for the appeal process, my frustration building. This was clearly targeted harassment. Patricia Henderson had it out for me, and I was starting to understand why. 3 months ago, I'd filed a complaint about her parking her SUV across 2 spaces in the community center lot during neighborhood meetings. Apparently, she didn't appreciate being called out for her hypocrisy. That evening, I drafted my appeal letter. I kept it professional, citing the specific times involved, the weather conditions, and the fact that multiple other properties had similar conditions without receiving violations. I attached my photographs as evidence and submitted everything through the HOA portal. The next day, I got a response, not from the management company, but from Patricia herself. She'd sent it to my personal email, which she must have gotten from the HOA directory. Mr. Morrison, your appeal has been received and will be considered at the March 15th board meeting. However, I feel I should inform you that your attitude toward HOA regulations has been noted by the board. Homeowners who cannot maintain their properties to community standards should consider whether this neighborhood is the right fit for them. Perhaps a less regulated area would better suit your lifestyle. Regards, Patricia Henderson, HOA Board President. I read the email twice, my jaw clenching harder each time. It was a barely veiled threat. Shape up or get out. The audacity of it made my blood boil. I forwarded the email to my personal account and saved it in 3 different places. If this was going to turn into a fight, I was going to document everything. Over the next few weeks, I noticed an increase in HOA activity around my property. Suddenly, inspectors were driving by multiple times a week. I got a violation notice for having a garden hose visible from the street, even though it was neatly coiled next to my garage exactly where it had been for 3 years. Another notice came for a small oil spot on my driveway where my car had been parked. I cleaned it immediately and sent proof, but the fines kept coming. I wasn't the type to back down from bullies, so I started doing my homework. I requested copies of all HOA violation notices issued in the past year through a formal records request. Ohio law required HOAs to maintain these records and make them available to homeowners. The management company dragged their feet, but eventually, I got a thick packet of documents. The pattern was clear. Patricia Henderson had issued violations at 3 times the rate of any other board member. More tellingly, certain homeowners received violations constantly while others, including several board members, had received none despite having visible issues with their properties. I made spreadsheets, highlighted patterns, and built a case that would make any lawyer proud. March 15th finally arrived. The board meeting was held at the community center, a bland building at the entrance to our subdivision. I arrived 15 minutes early with a folder full of documentation, printed photos, and my meticulously organized evidence of selective enforcement. The meeting room was set up like a small courtroom, with the board members sitting at a long table at the front and chairs arranged in rows for residents. About 20 people were scattered throughout the room, most of them there to appeal their own violations or complain about neighborhood issues. Patricia Henderson sat in the center of the board table, flanked by 4 other members. She was exactly what you'd picture when someone says, HOA Karen. Mid-50s, blonde hair cut in an aggressive bob, wearing a burgundy pantsuit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. She had that particular expression that came from years of telling people what to do and expecting immediate compliance. This meeting of the Riverside Meadows HOA board will now come to order, Patricia announced, banging a gavel unnecessarily hard. We have several appeals on the agenda tonight. First up is Mr. Xavier Morrison regarding violation notice number 2024-0847. I stood and walked to the front, setting my folder on the small podium they'd set up for residents. Good evening, board members. I'm here to appeal the $250 fine I received for ice on my front steps on February 6th. As outlined in my written appeal, the ice formed overnight from freezing rain. The photograph used as evidence was taken before dawn, approximately 6 in the morning. I had no reasonable opportunity to address the ice before the violation was issued. Patricia leaned forward, her fingers steepled in front of her. Mr. Morrison, are you arguing that homeowners shouldn't be responsible for maintaining safe walkways? Not at all. I'm arguing that it's impossible to prevent ice from forming overnight and unreasonable to expect homeowners to be awake and salting their walkways before sunrise. Other homeowners manage to keep their properties in compliance. Actually, that's not accurate. I pulled out my photographs. I have documentation showing at least 15 properties in this subdivision had ice on their walkways that same morning. None of them received violations. I'm asking why I was specifically targeted. A murmur went through the audience. Patricia's face flushed slightly, but her voice remained controlled. We cannot inspect every property every day, Mr. Morrison. Violations are issued when they're observed. Then explain this. I produced my records request documents. According to HOA records, I've received 14 violations in 3 years. My next-door neighbor, who sits on the Architectural Review Committee, has received 0 violations despite having a mailbox that doesn't meet the specifications outlined in the bylaws, visible trash cans that stay out for days, and a fence that's 6 inches over the height limit. The murmuring got louder. Patricia's jaw tightened. Are you accusing this board of impropriety? I'm presenting evidence of selective enforcement, which violates Ohio Revised Code Section 5312, governing HOA operations. The law requires equal application of rules to all homeowners. One of the other board members, a nervous-looking man in his 60s, cleared his throat. Perhaps we should review these documents, Patricia, if there's an appearance of selective enforcement. There's no need, Patricia snapped. Mr. Morrison, your appeal is denied. The fine stands. If you have concerns about how this HOA operates, you're free to run for the board in the next election. Next case. I'd like the record to show that I'm formally disputing this decision and will be seeking legal counsel regarding the HOA's pattern of harassment. Patricia's eyes narrowed. Noted. Sit down, Mr. Morrison. I returned to my seat, my hands shaking slightly from adrenaline. I'd expected the denial, but hearing it still stung. Around me, several residents gave me sympathetic looks. One woman leaned over and whispered, "She did the same thing to us last year. Cost us over $1,000 before we just gave up." The rest of the meeting was equally frustrating. Patricia ruled over it like a tyrant, dismissing appeals with barely a glance at the evidence presented. By the time the meeting ended, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't paying that fine, and I wasn't backing down. The next morning, I contacted a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes. His name was Robert Chen, and his office was in downtown Columbus. I'd found him through online reviews from other homeowners who'd successfully fought back against overzealous HOAs. "Mr. Morrison, thanks for coming in," Robert said, shaking my hand as I entered his office. He was younger than I expected, maybe early 40s, with sharp eyes that suggested he didn't miss much. "Tell me about your situation." I laid out everything. The ice violation, the pattern of harassment, the selective enforcement, Patricia's threatening email. I showed him all my documentation, the spreadsheets, the photographs, everything. Robert listened carefully, occasionally making notes. When I finished, he sat back in his chair. "You've got a solid case for selective enforcement and harassment. The threatening email is particularly damning. Here's what I recommend. First, we send a formal cease and desist letter to the HOA, demanding they rescind the fine and stop the targeted enforcement. Second, we file a complaint with the Ohio Real Estate Division. They oversee HOA operations and take these matters seriously. Third, if necessary, we file suit in county court for harassment and violation of state HOA regulations. How much is this going to cost me? My retainer is $1,500. If we go to court, it could run another few thousand. But here's the thing. If we win, and I think we will, the HOA has to pay your legal fees. It's part of Ohio HOA law. When an HOA is found to have violated regulations, they're responsible for the homeowner's costs. I thought about it for maybe 10 seconds. Let's do it. Robert drafted the cease and desist letter that afternoon. It was 6 pages of legal language that basically said, rescind the fine, stop the harassment, and compensate me for my legal fees or face a lawsuit. We sent it certified mail to Patricia Henderson, the HOA management company, and each board member individually. The response came faster than expected. 3 days later, I received a certified letter from the HOA's attorney. It was a formal denial of all claims and a counter threat that if I pursued legal action, they would seek to recover their legal costs from me when they prevailed. Classic intimidation tactic, Robert said when I forwarded him the letter. They're counting on you being scared off. Most homeowners are, but you've got documentation they can't argue with. Let's file the complaint with the state and prepare for court. The Ohio Real Estate Division complaint was submitted electronically. It included all my evidence, the violation notices, the records showing selective enforcement, and Patricia's threatening email. Robert told me the investigation could take months, but it would put pressure on the HOA. Meanwhile, life in Riverside Meadows became increasingly uncomfortable. I started noticing cars driving slowly past my house at odd hours. My neighbors stopped making eye contact when I waved. One evening, I found a note tucked under my windshield wiper. Troublemakers aren't welcome here. I documented everything. Every note, every suspicious car, every interaction. I installed a video doorbell and security cameras around my property. If this was going to escalate, I wanted evidence. Then, in mid-April, something happened that changed everything. It was a rainy Saturday morning. I was in my kitchen making breakfast when I heard sirens nearby. Fire truck and ambulance, from the sound of it. I didn't think much of it until my phone buzzed with a notification from the neighborhood Facebook group. Anyone know why there's an ambulance at Patricia Henderson's house? I felt a strange mix of concern and curiosity. I wasn't heartless enough to wish harm on anyone, even Patricia, but I couldn't help wondering what had happened. The details emerged over the next few hours through the neighborhood gossip network. Apparently, Patricia had slipped on her own front walkway that morning. It had been raining, and her brick walkway was slick with wet leaves and algae. She'd fallen hard, breaking her wrist and hitting her head. The ambulance had taken her to Riverside Methodist Hospital. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The woman who'd find me for ice on my steps had injured herself on her own poorly maintained walkway. Several neighbors commented on the poetic justice of it all, but I saw something else. An opportunity. That afternoon, I drove past Patricia's house. I didn't stop or get out of my car, just drove by slowly like any concerned neighbor might. Her brick walkway was clearly visible from the street. It was covered in wet leaves, moss, and what looked like several seasons' worth of grime. The bricks themselves were uneven, with several clearly loose or cracked. It was, by any objective standard, a safety hazard far worse than a thin layer of overnight ice. I took photos from my car, making sure to capture the street sign and house number. Then I did something that might have been petty, but felt absolutely necessary. I filed an HOA violation report against Patricia Henderson for failure to maintain a safe walkway. I submitted it through the official HOA portal with my photographs attached. The description read, "Walkway presents serious safety hazard, covered in debris, moss, and algae, uneven and damaged bricks. Property owner has already sustained injury due to these unsafe conditions. Immediate attention required per HOA Safety Bylaws Section 4.2. 2 days later, I received a response from the HOA management company. Not Jennifer this time, but someone named Thomas who identified himself as the senior property manager. "Mr. Morrison, thank you for your concern regarding 1247 Oak Hill Lane. However, we do not issue violation notices to board members based on complaints from homeowners currently in dispute with the association. This could be seen as retaliatory, and we must maintain neutrality in ongoing legal matters." I forwarded the email to Robert Chen with a note. "I think we just found our smoking gun." Robert called me an hour later. "Xavier, this is perfect. They just admitted in writing that they apply different standards to board members. That's exactly the selective enforcement we've been documenting. Forward me everything related to this. I'm amending our complaint to the state." The amended complaint was filed that week. It included the new photographs of Patricia's hazardous walkway, the violation report I'd submitted, and the management company's response admitting they wouldn't issue violations to board members. Robert also pointed out that Patricia's walkway violated the same safety bylaws she'd used to fine me. While all this was unfolding, Patricia was recovering at home. She'd posted on Facebook about her terrible accident and how lucky she was that her injuries weren't worse. The comments section was a mix of sympathy and thinly veiled criticism. Several residents pointed out the irony. A few mentioned my violation notice directly. One comment from a woman named Susan stood out. "Maybe this will teach the board that unexpected things happen, and sometimes conditions are beyond our immediate control. Some of us have been saying this for years." I wanted to reply but resisted the urge. Anything I said could be used against me in the ongoing dispute. 3 weeks after Patricia's fall, I received a notice about a special board meeting. The agenda included discussion of pending legal matters and potential board actions. I had a feeling I knew what this was about. The meeting was even more packed than the last one. Word had spread about my dispute with the HOA, and apparently I wasn't the only homeowner who'd had enough of Patricia's reign. The room was buzzing with conversations when I arrived. Patricia was there, her right wrist in a cast, looking considerably less confident than at the last meeting. The other board members looked uncomfortable. And there was someone new at the table, a man in a suit who was introduced as David Brewer, the HOA's attorney. "This meeting is called to order," Patricia said, her voice lacking its usual authority. "We're here to discuss several matters related to ongoing disputes with homeowners. Mr. Brewer will be advising the board." David stood, his expression professionally neutral. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. The board has asked me to review recent complaints and legal actions. After careful analysis of the documentation and Ohio HOA regulations, I have some recommendations. First, regarding the violation notice issued to Mr. Xavier Morrison for ice on his walkway. I believe the association's position is legally vulnerable. The evidence suggests the violation was issued under circumstances that may not meet the standard of reasonable enforcement. Patricia's face went pale. But the bylaws state that walkways must be maintained in safe condition. However, courts have consistently held that homeowners cannot be held responsible for weather conditions that occur overnight and are addressed in a reasonable time frame. Mr. Morrison salted his walkway the morning the violation was issued, which demonstrates responsible maintenance. So you're saying we should just let people ignore ice on their property? I'm saying that issuing a fine for ice that formed overnight, before the homeowner could reasonably address it, is not legally defensible. Additionally, the evidence Mr. Morrison has compiled showing selective enforcement creates significant liability for the association. Another board member, a woman named Carol, spoke up. What about the violation report Mr. Morrison filed regarding Mrs. Henderson's walkway? Should we address that? David's expression didn't change, but I saw a slight tightening around his eyes. That presents a more complex issue. Mr. Morrison's photographs clearly show conditions that violate the association's safety standards. However, the management company declined to issue a violation notice, citing Mrs. Henderson's position on the board. This creates an appearance of preferential treatment that could be problematic in the ongoing legal dispute. Patricia stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This is ridiculous. I'm the president of this board. I've dedicated countless hours to maintaining property values in this neighborhood. And now I'm being attacked because of an accident. Mrs. Henderson, please sit down, David said calmly. No one is attacking you. But the association has legal obligations under Ohio law, including equal application of rules to all residents, regardless of their position. The complaint filed with the Ohio Real Estate Division includes substantial evidence of selective enforcement. If the division investigates and finds merit to these claims, the consequences could be severe for the association and its board members personally. That got everyone's attention. The other board members exchanged worried glances. Personally, Carol asked, what do you mean? Under Ohio Revised Code Section 5312, board members can be held personally liable for willful and wanton misconduct, including discriminatory enforcement of HOA rules. If the state determines that violations were issued in a discriminatory manner, board members involved in those decisions could face personal fines and legal action. Patricia sat down heavily, her face now completely drained of color. David continued, I recommend the board take the following actions immediately. First, rescind the violation notice and fine issued to Mr. Morrison. Second, issue a formal apology. Third, conduct a comprehensive review of all violation notices issued in the past 3 years to ensure consistent enforcement going forward. Fourth, implement new policies requiring board approval for any violation fine exceeding $100. And fifth, consider whether Mrs. Henderson's continued service as president is in the best interest of the association, given her personal involvement in this dispute. The room erupted. Residents started talking all at once, some in support of the recommendations, others defending Patricia. I sat quietly, watching it all unfold. Patricia looked like she'd been slapped. You're suggesting I resign? I'm suggesting the board consider all options to minimize legal liability. The decision is yours to make, but I need to advise you of the potential consequences if this matter proceeds to litigation. Mr. Morrison's attorney has made it clear they're prepared to pursue this aggressively, and based on the evidence, they have a strong case. The meeting devolved into chaos after that. Board members argued with each other. Residents shouted from the audience. Patricia tried to maintain order but had clearly lost control. Finally, Carol called for a vote on David's recommendations. The vote was 4-1, with only Patricia voting against. The violation and fine were rescinded. A formal apology would be drafted, and the board would meet in executive session to discuss Patricia's continued role as president. I left that meeting feeling vindicated but not quite satisfied. I'd won the battle over the fine, but the larger issue of accountability remained unresolved. The formal apology arrived a week later. It was a single page, professionally worded, admitting that the violation notice had been issued in error, and that the fine had been rescinded with a full refund of any amounts paid. It said nothing about the pattern of harassment or the selective enforcement. It was the minimum required to meet the board's vote and nothing more, but other changes started happening. Patricia resigned as HOA president 2 weeks after the special meeting. The official statement said she was stepping down due to health concerns and time commitments, but everyone knew the truth. Carol took over as interim president and immediately implemented new enforcement procedures. Violations would be reviewed by the full board before fines were issued. All homeowners would receive warnings before fines for first-time violations, and a committee would be formed to review past violations for consistency. The neighborhood Facebook group exploded with reactions. Some residents celebrated Patricia's departure as long overdue. Others defended her, saying she'd been driven out by troublemakers who didn't want to follow the rules. The community was more divided than ever. Meanwhile, my complaint with the Ohio Real Estate Division was moving forward. I received a notification that an investigator had been assigned to the case and would be contacting me for an interview. The interview happened in early June. The investigator, a thorough woman named Linda Torres, spent 3 hours going through my documentation. She asked detailed questions about every violation I'd received, the circumstances around each one, and the patterns I'd identified in HOA enforcement. Mr. Morrison, I've reviewed HOA records from Riverside Meadows going back 5 years. Your analysis is correct. There's a clear pattern of selective enforcement, particularly during Mrs. Henderson's tenure as president. Certain homeowners, including board members and their friends, received significantly fewer violations despite observable compliance issues. Other homeowners, including yourself, received violations at rates far exceeding the community average. What happens now? I'm going to interview other residents and board members. I'll review the HOA's policies and procedures. And then, I'll make a determination about whether the association has violated state regulations. If I find violations, I can order corrective action and potentially impose fines on the association. In egregious cases, I can refer matters to the Attorney General's office for further action. Linda was true to her word. Over the next month, she interviewed dozens of residents. The neighborhood was abuzz with gossip about who'd been called in and what they'd said. I heard through the grapevine that Patricia had a particularly contentious interview where she'd defended her actions and insisted everything she'd done was by the book. In late July, the Ohio Real Estate Division issued its findings. The report was damning. It concluded that Riverside Meadows HOA had engaged in systematic selective enforcement of its rules, targeting certain homeowners while ignoring violations by others. It specifically cited Patricia Henderson's actions as board president as the primary source of these violations. The division ordered the HOA to 1. Refund all fines issued to affected homeowners over the past 3 years. 2. Revise its enforcement procedures to ensure consistency. 3. Provide training to all board members on Ohio HOA regulations. 4. Submit to quarterly audits for the next 2 years. 5. Pay a fine of $50,000 to the state. Additionally, the division imposed a personal fine of $10,000 on Patricia Henderson for willful misconduct in her role as board president. The report was public record, and I made sure every homeowner in Riverside Meadows received a copy. I posted it to the neighborhood Facebook group with a simple message. For everyone who thought I was just being difficult, here's the state's official findings. The reactions were mixed but mostly supportive. Dozens of homeowners commented that they'd experienced similar treatment. Several thanked me for standing up to the board when they hadn't been able to. A few still defended Patricia, claiming the investigation was biased, but they were in the minority. Patricia herself posted a long, rambling response claiming she'd been railroaded by a corrupt system and vindictive neighbors who didn't appreciate her years of service. She threatened to sue the state, the HOA, and me personally. But it was clear she'd lost whatever support she once had. The HOA's attorney, David Brewer, contacted me directly after the report was issued. "Mr. Morrison, the board would like to discuss a resolution to any remaining disputes. Would you be willing to meet?" Robert Chen advised me to take the meeting but not to agree to anything without his review. So a week later, I sat down with David, Carol, and 2 other board members in a conference room at the management company's office. "Mr. Morrison, first let me say again that the board apologizes for how this situation was handled," Carol began. "We take the division's findings seriously, and we're committed to making things right. In addition to the refunds ordered by the state, we'd like to offer you compensation for your legal fees and the stress this has caused you." "I'm listening." "The board is prepared to pay your attorney's fees in full, plus an additional $5,000 in compensation. In exchange, we'd ask that you agree not to pursue further legal action against the HOA or its board members." I looked at David. "Is Patricia agreeing to this? Mrs. Henderson is no longer on the board. This offer is from the current board only. What about the personal fine she has to pay?" "Is she actually paying it?" Carol sighed. "That's between her and the state. I know she's filed an appeal, but I doubt it will go anywhere. The division's findings were pretty conclusive." I thought about it. The vindictive part of me wanted to push further, to make sure Patricia paid in every possible way for what she'd done, but the practical part of me knew when to take a win. "I'll agree on one condition. The HOA issues a public statement to all homeowners acknowledging what happened and committing to fair enforcement going forward. Not some vague corporate nonsense, but a real acknowledgement that things were done wrong and will be done better." Carol nodded. "I think we can do that." The settlement was finalized 2 weeks later. I received a check for my legal fees plus the additional compensation. The HOA issued a detailed letter to all residents explaining the division's findings and outlining the new enforcement procedures. It specifically mentioned that all homeowners would be treated equally regardless of their relationship with the board. Robert Chen had one more piece of advice for me. "Xavier, you should consider running for the HOA board. You clearly care about the community, and you understand the rules better than most people. Plus, the best way to make sure this doesn't happen again is to be involved in the governance." I'd never considered it before. The idea of spending my evenings at board meetings and dealing with neighborhood disputes didn't appeal to me. But Robert had a point. If I wanted things to be better, I needed to be part of the solution. The next board election was in November. I filed my candidacy in September, running on a platform of fair enforcement and transparency. My campaign, if you could call it that, consisted mainly of the state's findings and my own experience. I didn't need to say much. The facts spoke for themselves. Election day came, and I won by a landslide. 3 other new board members were elected as well, all of them reform-minded residents who'd been inspired by my fight with Patricia. Carol remained on the board, providing continuity and institutional knowledge. My first board meeting as a member was both satisfying and sobering. Satisfying because I was now in a position to influence how the HOA operated. Sobering because I realized how much work needed to be done. Years of Patricia's leadership had created a culture of fear and arbitrary enforcement. Rebuilding trust would take time. One of my first actions as a board member was to propose a comprehensive review of all HOA bylaws. Many of them were outdated or unnecessarily restrictive. We formed committees of homeowners to provide input on what rules actually made sense for our community. The process took months, but by the following spring, we'd revised the bylaws to be more reasonable and consistently enforceable. We also implemented a new violation process. Before any fine was issued, homeowners received a courtesy notice giving them 2 weeks to address the issue. Fines were reserved for repeated violations or serious safety concerns, and all violation decisions were reviewed by the full board in open meetings where homeowners could present their perspective. The changes weren't universally popular. Some residents thought we were being too lenient. Others thought we should abolish the HOA entirely. But most people appreciated the effort to balance community standards with individual rights. As for Patricia Henderson, I saw her around the neighborhood occasionally. She'd paid her fine to the state after her appeal was denied. She'd also settled several lawsuits from other homeowners who'd sued her personally for harassment. The last I heard, she was considering moving to a different neighborhood, somewhere without an HOA where she wouldn't have to deal with community governance. One afternoon in late spring, almost a year and a half after that initial ICE violation, I was outside working in my garden when I saw Patricia drive past. She slowed down, looked at my house, and then kept going. I wondered what she was thinking. Did she regret how she'd handled things? Did she think she was the victim in all this? Or had she learned anything from the experience I'd never know, and honestly, it didn't matter. What mattered was that the community was healing. Neighbors were friendlier. People were less afraid of arbitrary fines and more willing to engage with the HOA. Board meetings were productive instead of contentious. We were becoming the kind of neighborhood people actually wanted to live in, not just one they tolerated because of housing prices. My own house was exactly as it had always been. Neat but not obsessively so. My mailbox was the right shade of black now, not because I was forced to change it, but because I'd repainted it as part of some general maintenance. My front steps were clear and safe, and I kept salt handy in case of ice. Not because I feared a violation notice, but because it was the responsible thing to do. That was the real lesson in all of this. Rules worked best when they were reasonable, consistently applied, and grounded in genuine concern for the community rather than personal power trips. An HOA could be a force for maintaining a nice neighborhood, or it could be a weapon for petty tyrants. The difference came down to the people involved and their motivations. I sometimes thought about that morning when I'd found the violation notice on my door, the photograph of my icy steps and Patricia's aggressive signature. If I'd just paid the fine and moved on, nothing would have changed. Patricia would still be terrorizing homeowners. The selective enforcement would have continued, and I would have learned to live in fear of the next arbitrary fine. But I hadn't backed down. I'd fought back with documentation, determination, and the willingness to stand up for what was right. And in the end, it had made a difference not just for me, but for everyone in Riverside Meadows. The irony of Patricia slipping on her own poorly maintained walkway never got old. It was the universe's way of delivering poetic justice, a perfect illustration of the hypocrisy that had defined her time as HOA president. She'd been so focused on finding fault in everyone else that she'd ignored the hazards in her own life. And when reality caught up with her, literally and figuratively, everything came crashing down. I'd learned a lot through this experience. I'd learned that documentation was essential, that standing up to bullies was necessary even when it was uncomfortable, and that systems only changed when people demanded better. I'd also learned that I could handle confrontation and legal challenges better than I'd thought. The experience had made me more confident, more aware of my rights, and more willing to speak up when things weren't right. The settlement money had more than covered my legal fees, and the additional compensation had paid for a nice vacation that summer. Robert Chen and I had stayed in touch, and he'd referred several other homeowners to me when they had HOA disputes. I'd become something of a community resource, helping neighbors understand their rights and navigate conflicts with the board. It wasn't something I'd planned, but it felt good to use my experience to help others. The neighborhood continued to improve under the new board leadership. Property values stayed strong because people actually wanted to live in Riverside Meadows now, not because they were forced to maintain their properties under threat of fines, but because they took pride in their community. The Facebook group became less contentious and more focused on positive neighborhood activities. We organized block parties, charity drives, and community cleanup days. One evening in June, about 2 years after the original ICE violation, I was at a neighborhood barbecue when Susan, the woman who'd commented on Patricia's Facebook post, approached me. "Xavier, I just wanted to thank you again for what you did. My husband and I were seriously considering moving because of the HOA harassment, but now we love living here. You made a real difference." "I appreciate that, Susan. I was just standing up for myself, but I'm glad it helped others too. You did more than that. You showed people that they didn't have to accept being treated unfairly. That matters more than you know." Similar conversations happened regularly. People would stop me at the grocery store or wave me down while I was walking my dog to share their stories and express their gratitude. It was humbling and gratifying in equal measure. The quarterly audits required by the State Division were initially a pain, but they forced the board to maintain excellent records and stay accountable. By the second year, the audits were routine, and the division expressed satisfaction with the HOA's reforms. There was talk of ending the monitoring early because of our exemplary compliance. As for enforcement of the safety rules that had started this whole mess, the board took a balanced approach. We sent out reminders before winter about the importance of keeping walkways clear of ice and snow. We offered to help elderly or disabled residents who might struggle with maintenance. And we only issued violations when there were genuine, ongoing safety hazards that residents refused to address after multiple warnings. The result was that our neighborhood was actually safer, not because we were threatening people with fines, but because we were fostering a culture of mutual responsibility and community support. People looked out for each other. Neighbors helped neighbors. And the HOA served its proper role as a coordinator and supporter rather than an enforcer and punisher. I served 3 years on the HOA board before deciding not to run for re-election. I'd accomplished what I set out to do. The culture had changed, the rules were fair and consistently applied, and new leadership was emerging that understood the principles of good governance. It was time to step back and let others carry the torch. My last board meeting was bittersweet. We'd accomplished a lot, but there was always more work to be done. Carol gave a nice speech thanking me for my service and acknowledging the role I'd played in transforming the HOA. The residents in attendance gave me a standing ovation, which was both embarrassing and touching. As I drove home that night, I reflected on the journey from that angry morning with the violation notice to this moment of recognition and gratitude. It had been stressful, expensive, and time-consuming. There had been moments when I'd wondered if it was worth the fight. But looking back, I had no regrets. I'd stood up for myself and others. I'd held power accountable. I'd helped create positive change in my community. And I'd learned that ordinary people could make a difference when they refused to accept injustice. The house at 482 Maple Grove Drive looked the same as it always had. But the neighborhood around it was fundamentally different, and so was I. That thin layer of ice on my steps had seemed like a minor annoyance at the time, but it had catalyzed a transformation that affected hundreds of people. Sometimes the smallest things lead to the biggest changes. A violation notice, a refusal to back down, a willingness to fight for what's right. These seemingly minor choices can cascade into major consequences. Patricia Henderson had thought she could intimidate me into compliance. Instead, she'd awakened something in me and others that led to her downfall and the reform of an entire system. The last time I saw Patricia was about 6 months after I left the board. She was loading boxes into a moving truck in front of her house. I was tempted to drive past without acknowledging her, but something made me stop. "Moving?" I asked, rolling down my window. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, not quite hostile but not friendly either. "Yes, fresh start somewhere else. I hope it goes well for you." She studied me for a moment. "Do you really?" "I do. I never wanted to hurt you, Patricia. I just wanted to be treated fairly." "You destroyed my reputation, cost me tens of thousands of dollars, got me kicked off the board I'd served on for 8 years. No, Patricia, you did that to yourself." I just refused to be a victim of it. She started to respond, then stopped. Her shoulders sagged slightly. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I got too caught up in the power and forgot why I joined the board in the first place. I really did want to maintain a nice neighborhood, you know." "I believe you. But good intentions don't excuse bad behavior." She nodded slowly. "I suppose not. For what it's worth, I am sorry, not for enforcing the rules but for how I did it, and for targeting you specifically." It was the first time she'd ever admitted any wrongdoing. "I appreciate you saying that. Take care of the neighborhood, Xavier. Don't let it turn into what I made it." "I won't. That's why I fought so hard." She returned to loading her truck and I drove away. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, but there was no joy in seeing someone broken by their own mistakes. Patricia had paid a heavy price for her abuse of power, perhaps heavier than she deserved. But consequences were important. Without them, nothing would ever change. Years passed. I stayed in Riverside Meadows, watching new families move in and the community continue to evolve. The HOA functioned smoothly under competent leadership. The old fears and resentments faded. Younger residents who moved in after the reforms had no idea what things had been like under Patricia's rule. To them, the HOA was just a normal part of neighborhood life, occasionally annoying but generally reasonable. But those of us who'd lived through it remembered. We remembered the fear of arbitrary fines, the frustration of selective enforcement, and the relief when things finally changed. We remembered that change was possible, but required courage and persistence. Sometimes new residents would ask me about the plaques in the community center listing past board presidents. They'd notice that Patricia Henderson's name covered 8 years, longer than anyone else, and they'd ask what she was like. She cared about the neighborhood, I'd tell them. But she forgot that the neighborhood was made up of people, not just properties to be managed. It's a lesson worth remembering. My front steps, the ones that had started this whole saga, were eventually replaced with new concrete when the old ones wore out. The new steps had better drainage and a textured surface that reduced ice buildup. But every winter when the freezing rain came, I'd look at those steps and remember where it all began. A thin layer of ice, a violation notice, a refusal to back down, and a chain of events that changed everything. People often asked me if I'd do it all again, knowing what I knew now. The stress, the conflict, the time and money spent fighting the HOA. My answer was always the same, absolutely. Because some things are worth fighting for: fairness, accountability, the right to be treated with respect in your own community. These aren't small things. They're fundamental to a functioning society. And if standing up for these principles meant going to war with my HOA, hiring a lawyer, enduring months of investigation, and becoming a controversial figure in my neighborhood, then so be it. The alternative was to live in fear and let injustice continue. That wasn't acceptable to me then, and it wouldn't be acceptable to me now. The story of my fight with the Riverside Meadows HOA became something of a legend in local homeowner circles. Other neighborhoods facing similar issues would reach out for advice. I'd share my documentation methods, explain the relevant laws, and encourage people to stand up for themselves. Some took the advice and fought back successfully. Others decided it wasn't worth the hassle and either paid the fines or moved away. I understood both responses. Not everyone had the time, resources, or temperament for a prolonged legal battle. But for those who did fight, the victories were meaningful. HOAs across the region started changing their policies, not out of the goodness of their hearts, but because they saw what had happened to Riverside Meadows and didn't want to face similar consequences. The Ohio Real Estate Division's ruling had sent ripples through the HOA community. Suddenly, board members had to think twice before issuing arbitrary fines or playing favorites. Accountability had teeth. That was perhaps the most satisfying outcome of the whole ordeal. My fight hadn't just changed my neighborhood. It had contributed to a broader shift in how HOAs operated, at least in Central Ohio. It was a small victory in the grand scheme of things, but it mattered to the people whose lives were affected. I eventually wrote up my experience and shared it online, hoping it might help others facing similar situations. The post went viral in HOA horror story circles, generating thousands of comments and shares. People from across the country reached out to share their own experiences and ask for advice. I'd stumbled into becoming an accidental advocate for HOA reform, a role I'd never sought but came to embrace. The attention wasn't always positive. Some people accused me of being a troublemaker who didn't respect community standards. Others thought I'd been too harsh on Patricia, that I'd ruined her life over a petty dispute. I understood these criticisms, but didn't agree with them. I'd simply demanded to be treated fairly and had used the legal system to enforce my rights when the HOA refused to be reasonable. As the years went on and my story spread, I was occasionally invited to speak at community meetings or homeowner forums. I'd share the lessons I'd learned. Document everything, know your rights, don't be afraid to stand up to authority, and remember that organizations are only as good as the people running them. These seemed like simple principles, but they were powerful when put into practice. The ice that had formed on my steps that February morning had long since melted. Patricia Henderson had moved on to whatever came next in her life. The HOA board I'd fought against had been replaced by new leadership, but the impact of what had happened continued to resonate. Every time I walked up my front steps, I was reminded of how a single moment of injustice had sparked a fight that changed my life and my community. It was a reminder that we all have power, even when we feel powerless. We have the power to say no to unfairness. We have the power to demand accountability. And we have the power to create change, even when the odds seem stacked against us. The story didn't have a villain who went to jail or a triumphant courthouse scene like in the movies. Real life was messier than that. But it had something better, a genuine resolution that made things better for real people. The Riverside Meadows HOA was now a model of fair governance. Neighbors trusted their board instead of fearing it, and homeowners knew that if they were treated unfairly, they had recourse and support. That was worth more than any dramatic courtroom victory. It was the quiet satisfaction of knowing that I'd left things better than I'd found them, that I'd stood up when it mattered, and that the fight had been worth it. So yes, Patricia Henderson had fined me for ice on my steps. And yes, she then slipped on her own poorly maintained walkway in a moment of perfect poetic justice. But the real story wasn't about ice or falls or fines. It was about power and accountability, about standing up to bullies, and about ordinary people creating extraordinary change when they refused to accept injustice. It was about community, responsibility, and the ongoing work of making the places we live better for everyone. And it was about learning that sometimes the smallest things, like ice on your steps on a cold February morning, can be the catalyst for transformation if you're willing to stand up and fight for what's right. That lesson stayed with me, shaped my choices, and reminded me every day that courage and persistence could overcome even the most entrenched systems of unfairness. The neighborhood kids who played in the streets of Riverside Meadows would never know how different things had been just a few years earlier. They'd never experienced the fear their parents had felt about leaving trash cans out 5 minutes too long or having a garden hose visible from the street. They'd grow up in a community where the HOA was a boring administrative necessity rather than a source of constant anxiety. That was my legacy, and I was proud of it. Not because I'd destroyed anyone or won some great victory, but because I'd made life a little bit better for the people around me. That was enough. That was everything,